It's the middle of September and the tomatoes in the greenhouse are starting to sort of do a diminishing returns thing, where I am still getting ripe tomatoes, but I'm also losing a lot of the tomatoes as they ripen. They're either rotting because of various ailments, or things are eating them. I think sometimes the birds come in here and have a little peck. And of course there's wood lice and slugs and all sorts of other things competing for my tomatoes. So I think we're going to draw a line under it. There are some ripe tomatoes to pick today, but I think I'm going to pick the green tomatoes, and we're going to make fried green tomatoes and dried green tomatoes. Right, so that is pretty much the end of the tomato harvest. I can see a few more in here. I'll come back and get them later. Oh, there's a nice one in there actually, let's have those. Nice couple here. And so we've got some ripe tomatoes, or ripening tomatoes. These are a combination of, well, that one's completely ripe. That one's just starting to go. That will ripen on the windowsill. And then we've got green tomatoes, which will not ripen, probably. So these we're going to make fried green tomatoes. There is also already another video where I've made green tomato chutney. Anyway, I thought it might be interesting to dehydrate some of these green tomatoes, because tomatoes, when they're green, they still have flavour. They still taste like tomatoes. They just need a little bit more preparing to get the flavour out than red tomatoes do. And I was thinking, sun-dried tomatoes intensify the flavour of tomatoes. So what happens if I dehydrate them in my dehydrator? Can't really sun-dry tomatoes in this country very easily, because by the time tomatoes start ripening, sunlight is starting to go away. We're sufficiently far north that by the time you have a real glut of tomatoes and you might be thinking about sun-drying them, the sun's going away. So anyway, I'm going to use my electric dehydrator and I'm going to dry these green tomatoes and then see what kind of a food product we end up with. I've also got these larger green tomatoes. These are going to be the ones that I do my fried green tomatoes with. And the thing with fried green tomatoes is apparently you want kind of slices out of the middle of the tomato. You don't want the ends. So the ends are going to end up in this dehydration process as well. So that's probably enough for that layer. Now the question that might be crossing your mind at this point is, why am I slicing them all in half like this, or quarters? Why not just dry them whole? Well, if you've got the luxury of the time and you've got free energy from the sun, then drying them whole obviously is something you can do. But this electric dehydrator costs me to run. It's not very expensive to run. I will do the calculations for it and I'll put those on screen. But chopping them up like this creates smaller pieces which will dry out quicker, and also breaking the skin means the moisture can come out from inside the berry and be evaporated. So I'll carry on filling up this dehydrator. I think it's only going to fill 3 trays probably, but we'll see how we go. I'm also not expecting that these tomatoes will retain this lush, vibrant green they have either. I think during the drying process we can expect these to go a bit beige. Alright, so we're going to switch that on, leave it going for about probably 10 hours. So today we've got some green tomatoes representing the end of the tomato harvest here at Shrimp Cottage, and I'm going to try to make fried green tomatoes. Now I've looked up several recipes for authentic fried green tomatoes on various websites and blogs. I can't get the ingredients that I need. Cornmeal is one of the things to use in the breading, and I can't find it anywhere. Polenta is normally how you find that packaged, but I looked in all the supermarkets and shops around here and I can't find any dry polenta cornmeal. So we're going to improvise. I will use some of these corn tortilla chips. The advantage of doing this is these are already seasoned. In fact, if anything, these might be a little bit over seasoned for what I want. So just to balance that out, I'm going to put in some of these crackers. These are actually poppy seed and sesame crackers. So not very authentic, but just tasting these tortilla chips, they're nice, but they're very salty. We're going to have about a teaspoonful of mixed herbs, just a little pinch of chili flakes. Alright, so I've got my crumbs, I've got a bowl of just plain flour here, and I've got an egg. So just going to beat an egg. Okay, not seasoning the flour because there is quite a lot of seasoning in these crumbs. I've just tasted them. Yeah, and as far as I can tell, what I'm aiming for is slices of tomato across like that. So maybe a thickish slice of tomato across the middle of the tomato. These ends will not go to waste, those will go up in the dehydrator. I'm drying green tomatoes. it's these middle slices that we really want. That one's got a bit of hollow. Some tomatoes tend to do that. These are all different varieties because this is the pickings from the greenhouse. Just basically the ends of all of the tomatoes. Okay, so that's all going to go to the dehydrator. These are my tomato slices for breading. Not very many here, but only cooking for 2 people. So we take a tomato slice and toss it in flour, which hopefully will give the egg something to grab onto. So we're going to do wet hand, dry hand. So the egg, and then into the crumbs, and using my dry hand to toss the crumbs over the top. And then we're going to go back into the egg and we're going to have some more crumbs. Try and get a kind of double coating. Okay, that looks like it worked. So there's my breaded tomato. Repeat until they're all done. So that's all of my breaded tomato slices. I did have to break out another egg. And I did realise halfway through that I've omitted a step that is in some recipes, which is to salt the slices of tomato, to dry brine them, to draw some of the moisture out. I haven't done that. Not all the recipes I looked at did that. So I guess we'll see what happens. I think probably deep frying these would be best, but I don't have a deep fryer and I'm not going to commit a huge amount of fat to a pot that I'm going to use once. So I'm going to shallow fry these, but in this deep casserole dish, because that will hopefully contain some of the splashing and splattering. I'm going to use about a 50-50 mix of lard and vegetable oil, just because that's what I happen to have. And as you can see, my oven is not level. Well, we can make good use of those little bits of batter that were stuck to my fingers. I reckon that needs to be a little bit hotter than that before we put them in. So another test. Yeah, that's a little bit more vigorous. I reckon that's probably hot enough. So very carefully, I'll just put a few of these in here. I'm not going to put too many in because it will cool down the pan, but also it'll be difficult to manage if I put too many in. So I'll go for about half of them. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Although you can see we're losing a fair bit of the crumb off of them as well. Now they've started to spit and bubble, which suggests to me that some of the juices are starting to express from the tomatoes now, which probably means the tomatoes are cooked inside. They're nice and crispy. A little bit longer. Could have maybe done with that oil being a little bit deeper. There's going to be a little bit of an edge on them, but perhaps not quite as well fried as I might like. However, I can probably figure out a way. That first batch can come out onto some kitchen paper towel on a plate. Some people have suggested using a rack instead of a towel here, because apparently the fat will drip away. But I think if you do that, you'll lose the kind of wick effect. It'd be an interesting thing to do a bit of empirical science on that to see how much oil is retained if you drain on a rack versus paper. I think as long as you put them onto paper that isn't already dripping with oil, it's probably better that way. Those look pretty good. Those have come out really well. Right, there's all my fried green tomatoes. They look all right. To go with this, we're going to have a sort of a dip. We're going to make that with sour cream, to which I'll just add some snipped chives from the garden. And also, we're going to make this into almost like a tartar sauce. Tartar sauce is normally made from mayonnaise with capers and cornichons. So I'm doing soured cream with capers and cornichons and chives. I'm also having that just a little pinch of salt. And I would say a little squeeze of lemon juice, but I think it's probably going to be interesting enough. So, yeah, that's good. Let's give these a little taste. So, well, I'll try them without the dressing first. So, there we go. I'm really happy with the way the breading has stayed together there. Interesting how different green tomatoes are. They don't taste underripe, they just taste like a different thing. Tastes kind of a lot more fruity, like a gooseberry or something. I'm going to call that a success. Do let me know in the comments how you might have done that differently, or how close you think I got to something that's kind of authentic. This bit was recorded at the end of dinner when we've actually eaten these alongside some mashed potatoes, and they do go rather well with creamy mashed potatoes. And it's important to know any critique of this thing, it has to be a critique of my implementation of these fried green tomatoes, because I've never had the authentic thing. I can only judge this version of it, which I might have fouled up. The tomatoes are kind of lost in there somewhere, really. Green tomatoes don't really have a flavour that shouts like red tomatoes do, and as a result, the flavour of the tomato is kind of lost behind the seasoning and just the flavour of the breading. Nice enough though, but quite subtle in flavour. Okay, the following morning, a change has taken place. Now I did swap these trays around. When you're using this dehydrator, the trays at the bottom tend to dry quicker than the ones at the top. So about halfway through drying, I swapped them all around. But even the ones at the bottom are looking quite dry. They've lost a lot of volume. This goes to show you how much of these things is water. But they still feel a bit moist. So I'm going to run this again. I do find with this dehydrator it's best to run it, then let everything sit, and the remaining moisture in the fruit equalises, and then drying it again after it's sat for about 12 hours is more effective than just running it for the total time in one batch. Reason being, you get something called case hardening, where you've dried out the outside of the object, and that dry skin is preventing any further moisture from coming to the surface. So you dry it a little bit, and then capillary action causes the moisture to equalise out again. Also the pores of the material kind of open up a bit. And then you dry it a second time, and you get a much more effective drying for the same total duration. They smell interesting. I'm tempted to taste one. Actually, in fact, I will taste one. So we'll taste this one. It's kind of about as dry as I would expect it to be. They smell very, very sweet and fruity, not very tomatoey. But what do they taste like? Well, somebody gave me that and I tasted it blind and they asked me what it was. I would say apple or plum. I tried some wild plums one time to make my own prunes, and they tasted a little bit like this, although they were more sour. The key sort of fruity note in here is more like apple than it is tomato. Okay, but anyway, this has got to run for probably another 5 hours. But what does it cost to run this machine? Well, we're going to find out. So I'll plug it into this meter and I'm going to measure it for an hour. Okay, so in 1 hour of operation at 55 degrees Celsius, which is just above the middle of the temperature range, this device consumed 0.18 of a kilowatt hour. So here are the figures for how much it costs to run that for 10 hours, which is probably 10 hours is the minimum amount of time I would run it for some very thinly sliced mushrooms for drying, or 20 hours for this kind of a project. This is probably going to take a total of 20 hours of drying. Those calculations are on the screen, including the prices at my current rate of billing for electricity, not including the standing charge, which I have to pay just to have electricity in the house. I'm going to make something with these dried green tomatoes. First I need to rehydrate them. Now that might seem a little bit weird because I only just dehydrated them, but obviously I can't eat them when they're like that. Just a little bit of boiling water, just enough to cover them, and we'll let those sit for an hour or so. Now do realise obviously you can ripen tomatoes off the plant, so here's the last one we picked. That one's got a bit of a hole in it actually, but it looks like it is going to ripen. So I could have ripened some of those tomatoes off the plant. Indeed, that's what happened with all of these. These are ones that were starting to turn. The very small ones I don't think would have ripened off the plant, because really when you ripen tomatoes on the windowsill, they have to be at least at the point of starting to ripen before you pick them. The ones that are really small would probably just shrivel up and go mouldy. Okay, these green tomatoes have had a couple of hours of soaking, and I'll tell you what, I'm not very hopeful this is going to make a tasty sauce. However, I'm going to try it. I'm going to keep things simple, and I'm not going to cook the pasta until I know the sauce has worked. I'm going to use onion, garlic, some herbs, and these tomatoes, and a bit of salt, and we'll see what we end up with. Garlic, and then we'll turn the heat right down. And then while that garlic is just cooking through, these tomatoes, which are still quite kind of really weirdly rubbery now. Anyway, just going to chop those up. Now I'm going to resist the temptation to add tomato puree to this sauce, because I think that will contaminate the test result here, really, because I want to taste what these dried tomatoes are doing. I don't want to add any other tomato or anything else to give a really robust flavour, because that's what I'm hoping, although hope is faint right now, but that's what I'm hoping we're going to get from this. Okay, so in with my rehydrated dried green tomatoes. I will just fry these a little bit. I mean, one thing to note is that even if this does work, it's not a particularly appetising colour, so maybe these would work in a pesto or something like that though. A little pinch of dried herbs, and then this liquid that the tomatoes were soaking in. I'm just going to simmer that for a minute or two. Alright, well there it is. Kind of weird, slightly musky aroma. It's not what I would call a sauce. It's too chunky. There's no real sauce there. But, and I think if you did this with ripe sun-dried tomatoes, you'd have much more of a sticky, caramelised sort of sauce, because they almost dissolve. These have not done that. Anyway, tasting time. Not good. Quite bitter, which might not be a good thing itself in green tomatoes. That might indicate there's a high level of solanine in there. Only ever so slightly fruity, and it's like a weird combination of raisins and sour plums. So I think this is the point where I'm going to declare dried green tomatoes not a success, not a viable idea at the moment. Maybe I should have just left them and seen which ones would actually ripen on the shelf. Maybe I'd have got some more ripe tomatoes, but you live and learn. So that's a bit of a disappointment. And these dried green tomatoes are really, as far as I'm concerned, only fit for compost now. I don't think I could even rehydrate them and pickle them. So in future, I think green tomatoes, I will try to ripen some on the windowsill, or I'll make green tomato chutney. Unless you've got any better ideas. I'm not tremendously disappointed, because, you know, you don't know unless you try. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.